So our first panelist is Pete Chiarelli, who's a retired 4-star general, spent 40 years in the Army, the Department of Defense, and in that role he dealt a lot with the wounds of war, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and suicides. For the last five or so years, he's been the CEO of One Mind, which is an advocacy and research group. Well, one of their purposes is to try to figure out and help the research establishment do a better job of accelerating the pace of all the neuroscience research that's been going on to deliver more treatments, biomarkers, et cetera, and get that out into the hands of people who could use it. So, Pete, I have a couple of questions for you, but being a general, you can say whatever you want, so and nobody's going to say anything about it. But given your experience I just outlined, what have you learned as to what have been the barriers to accelerating the translation of these effective interventions out into the use of where people can use it, whether they're soldiers or others? And then what solutions would you recommend in this area?
Well, it's a long answer, but I'll try to summarize it in a few words. I came at this problem, first of all, I'm a liberal arts major, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. To me, to be dabbling in neuroscience is kind of amazing. But I came at this problem from my time as Vice Chief of Staff of the Army when I realized, and in that job, my responsibility was to look forward in the organization and see what the huge problems were going to be. And it was pretty obvious to me early into the job that the big issues for us medically were going to be traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. When I became vice in 2008, we had 32% of our most seriously wounded had traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress. When I left, that number was up to 67%, 17% TBI and 50% post-traumatic stress. I also realized that we did not have good treatments. We had not a single FDA-approved drug for post-traumatic stress. All the drugs that you hear that are given to soldiers are all drugs that are off-label prescriptions of other drugs brought to market for other things. And we can't even really define traumatic brain injury. If you go to the CDC, there's 42 different definitions of traumatic brain injury. So I worked this problem when I was vice, and when I came out and went to work for One Mind, I was naive in thinking that if I just used my good name and the experience that I'd brought up and raised a lot of money and turned it over to the researchers, they would find the answers, because there weren't any answers. And I came to realize that what we have is a broken research ecosystem. It is absolutely not established to support the patient, in my humble opinion. The coin of the realm is papers, not necessarily the translation of scientific discovery into products, approved products that will help the patient. For the last 5 years, I've been working with a group of scientists that decided to come together and work around open science. There are 19 level 1 trauma centers in the country. They've enrolled 2,400 folks with traumatic brain injury and followed them for a year. They are very, very close to FDA approval of both an imaging biomarker and a blood biomarker for mild and moderate traumatic brain injury, which affects not only soldiers, but 2.8 million Americans a year. They've gone further in 4 years than anybody's gone, some people say in 20, I say in history. Nobody has got this quickly to diagnostics that are going to allow the stratification of patient populations, provide targets for drug companies, device companies, and treatments to see if many of the things you see out here, what portion of the patient population do they work on? However, they're being criticized today because they worked hand in glove with the FDA to get to the point that they are today. And when they did that, they put aside the writing of peer-reviewed papers. And their funding, for follow-on funding, is in jeopardy because they haven't produced anything. Now, I submit that when you have a system that is set up to say, working with the FDA to get approval of a biomarker or biomarkers for diagnostics that we don't have, when a system is set up to say that your follow-on funding is in jeopardy because you have not produced papers rather than working with the FDA to get approvals, that to me is a broken system. And I believe the research ecosystem has to be looked at. And we need to look at this idea that seems to guide where we're going, and this idea of publish or perish. Because I just don't think that's the yardstick that we need to be using to help the patient.
That's great. Thank you, Pete. We'll have after everybody presents, we'll have some time for questions from the audience and among ourselves as well, so we can explore some of these. But I think we should volunteer you to run the National Institutes of Health, Pete. How would you like that job? So our next panelist is Carlos Pena, who's with the FDA. He's the Division Director for the Division of Neurological and Physical Medical Devices. I won't read you the other aspects of that because it's confusing, but he's a senior person with the FDA, very appropriate for this discussion. He's had 15 years with the FDA. And so a couple of questions for Carlos. One is, as many people may know, the 21st Century Cures Bill altered a number of things about the FDA in terms of evidence and what needs to be collected. That's been a big theme in many of our presentations about what is enough evidence before you can safely and effectively promulgate these interventions. So it would be helpful to hear what did that change, how is that changing what the FDA does, if at all? The second would be, can you give us an update of the FDA role in terms of digital and software? So one of the things in the behavioral area is that many of the psychosocial treatments, for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy or other digital interventions, they're not regulated by the FDA. None of these psychosocial treatments are. But when you digitalize them, the FDA has a role, at least in some of them. So it'd be helpful to hear, what are you regulating and what aren't you? And then finally, what should the audience know about, if you're considering coming to the FDA, what advice would you give?
Sure. So I have a couple slides. I have like 10 slides, and I think it's helpful, especially when people don't know a lot about what FDA does in the area of devices. It's helpful to talk about the information that we look at and be very specific. So first slide is that we've been involved in neurological devices for some time, and this is an array of products, spans a cognitive assessment product to an ablation therapy to a stroke device, prosthetic arm, a non-invasive stimulator for pain, all the way to a microcatheter. And purpose is not to share with you the individual data sets that were part of those products getting to the market, but share with you that each product had a tailored review linked to the safety and effectiveness of that product. And the evidence needed for those products to get to market was also linked to the safety and effectiveness, the benefits and the risks of that product. These products were reviewed in the Division of Neuro. I lead the Division of Neuro and Physical Medicine within the Center for Devices at FDA. It's one of the newest divisions, and I think it speaks to the investment the agency is making in this area, this rapidly growing and emerging area. The next slide shows a sort of regulatory pathways. So all the products from the previous slide, these are the types of pathways that sponsors, investigators, innovators, many folks at this forum will take to get the product to the market. And a device is typically a product that diagnoses, treats, or prevents a neurological disorder, at least for neurological devices. It does this without chemical action. We can label a medical device even in the absence of claims that it is a medical device if it affects the structure and function of the body. And that has a lot of implications for non-invasive products, digital health products. We like to have those discussions. The pathways that you see in blue are where we interact with sponsors and developers. But hopefully those interactions occurred during the green portion of that timeline, which is the research and development phase. If people think it's too early to contact FDA, that is the best time to contact FDA. We would have those discussions when people are thinking about the animal studies to design, prior to human studies, prior to collection of evidence, because all that takes money, it takes hiring decisions, it takes business decisions, and you want to have those discussions early on so you can map out what is needed to get your product to the marketplace, and you can share that with your investors because they would want to know what the likelihood of it is to get to market. These are a few of the concepts we think about when those products proceed along the various regulatory pathways. And devices are classified based upon risk, class 1 to class 3. Class 1 typically is the lowest risk product area that we have, all the way up to class 3, which are the highest risk product levels. And during the assessment of each of these types of devices, we ask questions about benefit risk. We ask questions about the safety and effectiveness that was shown. We ask questions about the valid scientific evidence. Many times you can have devices that are studied in a randomized control study, very expensive. We typically reserve those for the highest risk devices, all the way down to case control, significant human experience studies, which is a different type of data set. We also look at the reasonable assurance of how that data set supports the claims that you're making about a product, and we look about the least burdensome way of getting that product to the market. Those are costs that we want to make sure are matched to the types of questions that we have, and of course we look at the indications for use. There's a couple guidances that I think particularly relevant to the questions you asked about information technology. One is our mobile medical apps guidance. This is the guidance that talks about those applications that could be found on mobile phones. Typically they are diagnostic in nature, although some may be therapeutic. This guidance document I would encourage folks to take a look at. It provides our current thinking about what our views about mobile medical apps are. Included in the guidance are a number of appendices that show examples of, if you have this is the type of oversight we have. And there are a lot of examples. These guidance documents, they take forever inside the agency to get out. But once they're out, they are very helpful to sponsors and developers in moving their product to the marketplace in as quickly and efficiently and as least burdensome as possible. This guidance typically targets devices that look at mental acuity, wellness. I think I've seen a lot of products here that have talked about that. This is a second guidance that I would encourage folks to see, because sometimes there are products that we don't have a lot of questions. We want to get out of the way of the development of that product and have that product get to the market as quickly as possible. And also, again, there are some examples in that guidance. The third one is the benefit risk considerations, and whether you have a class 1 low risk device, tongue depressor, or class 3 device, deep brain stimulation, non-invasive stimulation, we will look at the benefit risks of that product and assess the safety and effectiveness that is shown for that product, the data supporting that product. And that's a third guidance, and that's linked back to the considerations, a few considerations that I had in the third slide of this presentation. 21st century cures was talked about, was requested. And so here I've put up some of the areas that we would exclude from our oversight with regard to software that are related to medical products, including maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle, serving as electronic patient records, data sets, all the way to providing recommendations to healthcare professionals for clinical decisions. Those would be excluded from our oversight. So we're trying to think of a very risk-based, efficient approach to getting this type of technologies to patients, to caregivers, and to consumers in as quickly as possible. So I just have 3 more slides, but you're probably asking yourself, okay, Carlos, you showed a couple guidances, you have this, the 21st century cures, there's all these regulatory pathways. I have no idea where to start. I don't know who to talk to, and I still don't know what FDA does. And the best way to engage the FDA is through our pre-submission program. The pre-submission program allows you, it's free. You can do it by phone, you can do it in person. You submit an application to us, we can have an informational meeting, all the way to having a very specific focused questions meeting about your product. about how to get it to market, about the preclinical testing that may be needed, about the bench testing that might be needed. The pre-submission pathway is the best way to engage the FDA about your product and even assess does your product even have any kind of oversight. Because if the oversight questions are minimal, we want to move your product as quickly as possible to the marketplace. But the pre-submission pathway and program is how we would like to interact with folks, the sponsors and developers in this space. I've mentioned a little bit about the types of questions that we look at. I'm putting up some of the devices that we assessed. We have a division of staff that spans from neurointerventional to neuromodulation, neurostimulation, physical medicine, rehabilitation. I've seen a couple applications for that. I would encourage folks to take a look at the pre-submission guidance and engage the agency. I think one of our limitations is that we are unable to reach out to as many of the stakeholders as possible. While we have a website, while we have webinars, there is still work to be done in making sure folks know who to contact at the agency, especially at the Center for Devices. And in closing, I'll make three remarks. One is, find out more about FDA. I think sometimes people don't know where to start, but if they look at the guidances, they look at some of the examples that we've shown, some of our decisions, things I think begin to make sense as long as you start that communication. The second remark I have is that if you, again, think it's too early to contact FDA, that is the best time to contact FDA, because then we can help you with business decisions, which would impact not only the device questions that you have, or that we have, and that you may want answered, but also you can make business decisions, hiring decisions, lay out a development plan that you can share with investors. And third, reach out to us. So I put my contact information down there. Contact me, contact the division. I think you'll be surprised. We've been trying to make some steps in making the process as transparent as possible. I think you'll be surprised with the interaction that you have with FDA in the future going forward.
Thank you. I have one quick question before we go on to our next panelist. So with a new device, let's say, that has a new claim, so it's clearly going to be regulated by the FDA, has the evidence that the FDA would have required before the 21st Century Cures Act changed at all, or is it the same?
It will depend upon the claims that you're making. If there is a technology that we are familiar with that's already in the market, but you're making a new claim about that technology, we may have one set of questions that we would want to know. If it's a new technology that adheres to some of the prescriptive mandates of 21st Century Cures, we may not have questions because that may be excluded from our oversight. If there is a product with claims that routes through a physician, the information goes to a physician rather than a patient or consumer, the physician is a well-trained medical professional. We may have less claims because that reduces the risk of a device's impact upon patients and caregivers. It reduces our uncertainty questions because it's going through a professional who knows about the patient or about the history of a product impact upon their patient. So, pre-submissions. Go through the pre-submissions process. It's free. I would encourage folks to use it. It's such an easy way to find out about your product. And also, if it's not even, have oversight for the product.
Great, thank you. So our next panelist is Adam Gazali, who many of you heard speak yesterday. He's a professor of neurology, physiology, and psychiatry at the University of California in San Francisco. He's one of the leaders in this whole area of neuroscience and developing different non-invasive games and other ways to alter your brain for both treating illnesses but also for performance enhancement. So Adam, I have a couple of questions. One of these you follow up on what in your presentation yesterday, because you developed a video game for treating ADHD that you've now licensed out, and it's going through the FDA regulatory process. So what kind of recommendations do you have, based on your experience with this, to what would you take to the FDA and why? And then what recommendations would you have to users, right, to determine quality and effectiveness if you don't go through the FDA? So if you've got a product that you you or your investors say, well, no, well, we don't think this needs to go to the FDA, and they decide to not regulate it, or they don't even know about it.
Use the
what
pre-submission
were your
process.
what are your thoughts on that? And then finally, what challenge do you see in terms of reimbursement?
Okay, there's a lot of questions. I'll try to go through them. Maybe I'll start by sort of addressing what both Pete and Carlos said with a real-world case example, which is my own. After doing basic science for well over 20 years and compiling 90 peer-reviewed publications, became frustrated with the process of investigating but not translating and moving discoveries and ideas I had into people's lives. And so 2008 was a pivot point for me, and I talked about it yesterday, where I decided to engage in technology creation using our expertise in neuroscience and our understanding of interactive technologies. But we continued producing peer-reviewed papers at that point. So I wear two hats, so I'm going to try to walk through them. I think there is a very valid and important use for basic science where the outcome is peer-reviewed publications, including our Nature publication, which came from our NeuroRacer study, which was the game we developed to help attention abilities. But at that, and what we did there was we showed mechanistically what was going on in terms of plasticity. We had feasibility of using this in a population, in that case older adults. We were able to show neurally what was occurring that led to transfer and sustainability. And we accomplished our goals of a basic science publication of what I always describe as showing that there was a signal that something was valuable there. But at that point, it was clear to me that the evidence that we generated, as exciting as we thought it was, and a publication in Nature is around as good as you get as a basic scientist, wasn't enough to put it out there as a clinical tool to help people. That we were very aware of that. The sample size wasn't large enough. It was a different type of study. And I think that's really important to understand, is that it's not worse, better, it's just different. Our goals there were not to create a clinical product. Our goals there were to show that we were developing something that had a meaningful effect and that it was worthy of further development and investigation. At that point, I realized that we couldn't go further in our laboratory, and so I started a company, Akili, as you heard yesterday, where the technology was then patented, IP was created around it. It was licensed to Akili, a company that then took the development to the next stage with an entire team of technologists, and then proceeded to create studies to move towards clinical validation as a medical device, something that we were not prepared to do or even interested in doing in our laboratory. We continue to do that basic science work there and then move this process over. So now I'll switch hats, and as Akili, I'm not an executive there, but I am a board member and an advisor, a founder, so I've followed and worked closely through this process. So Akili made the decision to not be a consumer technology company, to not put out devices with just broad wellness claims, which would be exempt from the FDA, but actually to engage early with the FDA, very early. We had 2 full pre-submission meetings, and we are now completing a phase 3 registration trial for a clinical indication of pediatric ADHD that we essentially designed with the FDA during the pre-submission process. And that's being completed now, and then we'll be submitting that data very soon to the FDA. I am a strong advocate of that pathway when appropriate, and it is appropriate when you have a clinical indication, as we do, trying to make a claim, in many ways as strong as a claim made by a drug used for that treatment. We do believe we have a better side effect profile, but it's still not, it's still responsible to consider side effects if you're describing a treatment that you think is going to have powerful effects. And so I think that pathway is appropriate for that goal. And so we engaged early, and I echo everything as a case example. We're not through the finish line yet, but that's because the research took a long time. But that research is just finishing up right now. So it's all blinded, so we'll see. The jury's still out on that. So I think that answers the beginning of it. If we have other technologies. We have other 8 games that are not part of Akili, but part of Neuroscape at UCSF. Some of them may not go through this medical device pathway. They may be licensed to a company that wants to put them in the education space or wants to put them in the consumer space. And that pathway may not be appropriate for FDA. And it'll have a different indication and it will go a different path. So not everything we do is going to go this way, but this first product that we created is going this way in a very focused manner. In terms of reimbursement, again, we don't know the future. As far as like a video game, what we've created, putting it out there, it's really in many ways the first of its kind. We have full-time employees at Akili whose only job it is to interact with insurance companies and other reimbursers right now. And they are having good, positive interactions, just like we had good, positive interactions with the FDA. So we'll know a lot more in a year from now, but that's the story.
Very helpful, Adam. That's a good, clear. You actually answered every question. So our next panelist is Walter Greenleaf, who is a medical technology developer in the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford. He has several decades of experience in the medical virtual reality field, and he's like Adam. He's not only a neuroscience researcher, but he has a lot of experience in commercializing and putting out for commercial use, consumer and provider use for many of the products that he's helped develop. So I have several questions for you, Walter. Okay. So based on the research you've done, the companies you've helped create, what barriers do you see that block a more accelerated dissemination of these new technologies for both treatment and performance enhancement? And what are your solutions? What ideas would you have? And then what are your recommendations about best practice for regulating these new technologies if the FDA is not involved? So, you outlined several of these where you wouldn't go the FDA route. The FDA Carlos may or may not agree with that, but they would have the final say. But assuming the FDA passes on it, and then also what are your thoughts which is a very common situation in the medical world and in the behavioral world, where we have an intervention that has some evidence, maybe a couple of randomized trials, maybe cohort studies, expert panels, but there's a debate about the level of evidence. And that is certainly common, which I find often in the behavioral field. They don't seem to be aware this debate is very frequent in the medical side. Just look at off-label use of medications, an off-label non-FDA approval. So if you look at almost every specialty areas, whether it's cardiology, infectious disease, mental health, anywhere from 30 to 70% of drugs given by physicians or other licensed practitioners are non-FDA approved. And the science of those are all over the map. There's not a clear regulatory process for that, and of course the manufacturers can't be involved. So this is true in the behavioral side. We've got things that have some evidence, but there's a huge debate about whether or not it should be paid for, and what thoughts would you have about how we deal with that? Walter?
Okay. 4 questions.
4 questions, right.
I think there's about to be some major disruptive changes to this whole process. There's a revolution going on of digital medicine. There's such a powerful data collection system that we keep in our pockets that understands our behavior, who we're interacting with, what our moods are, where we go, and how fast we go in collecting biological data and social information, along with everything else that's going on with digital medicine. And as a consequence of that revolution, and my excitement right now is particularly in the field of how virtual reality technology is going to affect behavioral health. It's going to make it possible for us to address some very difficult problems with some very profound ways of changing mood and behavior and cognitive processes. I'll talk about that later today. As a result of what I see the situation, I think things are going to change. I see this tsunami of new technology coming out, and just as you were talking about off-label with prescriptions, I think digital medicine is going to hit the barriers that you talked about. And I'll mention a few of those barriers that I see right now. And it's going to, just like water rushing down a hill and hitting a dam, it's going to find ways around. And if that dam doesn't open the floodgates and change the processes, it's going to burst through that dam. There's such a pent-up need for better solutions in the mental health, behavioral health arena. And the friction point of creating those solutions is changing, that there's going to be a disruption. And who knows where it's going to land. We do need regulation. We do need ways of validating efficacy and noting those processes and pathways which are the right ways to go and which are the dangerous ways to go. But I think our existing systems are not adequate to keep up with the tsunami of change that's coming. Some of the applications that are being developed are more on the health and wellness arena, and they will reach populations pretty fast. Many are in the clinical arena, and they're in combination with pharmaceuticals and other medical devices. But we are going to have new ways of validating efficacy. I'd like to see some of the clinical societies get involved in helping the product development companies develop the market requirements document and the product requirements documents, because the startups that are coming from the technology sector need guidance on how to do things the right way. Many of the startups that I talk to come to me and say, should we even bother with FDA approval? We have a pathway to get directly to the consumer. Should we even bother with validating our products? And I tell them about the pre-submission process and encourage them to go that way. Not all of them are paying attention. And worldwide, there's such a pent-up need. Things are just going to rush forward. You asked about what I see as the barriers right now for the current pathway for the approval process. I think it's expensive and it takes time to go through the current pathways. Yet there are workarounds that many companies have, such as data mining from large data sets, doing A/B testing with different applications that they've developed and seeing which ones work, collecting crowdsourced data and using big data analytics to tease that apart and look at efficacy. So a lot of the natural experiments that are out there are going to be taken advantage of by the new digital health interventions. Some of the barriers are conceptual. Many individuals will not want to use a new digital health intervention if it's combined with a medical device or with a drug or a standalone, if it doesn't have FDA approval or if it doesn't have a prescription behind it written by a doctor. Yet we don't really have a good mechanism for a doctor to write a prescription for a digital health intervention. So again, there's an inefficiency in the pathways that either the existing reimbursement or regulatory organizations will adapt to, or the force that's coming will find a way to go around it, especially in countries like China, where there are less, there's such an acute need, such a few number of clinicians, and such extreme problems with mental health issues, stress, and other issues. Remind me of your second question.
I think that was, no, you're answering the questions. It's very helpful. I was asking, one of the questions was when we've got some evidence, but not, there's a debate about the level, which we see a lot in these areas. Again, in medical, but also in the behavioral area. You have any thoughts on how would we best, how do we handle that? Because it's the off-label drugs thing is a good example. Those drugs are paid for by and large by insurers. I mean, frankly, if the insurers tried to stop paying for all off-label drugs, you'd shut down the medical system for treatments. So it's up to the doctor and the patient to some degree to make a decision about the use of those because the FDA is not involved. Yeah. So there may be some studies. So you have, and there are lots of other medical interventions that don't have more than a few studies. What's your thoughts about that in the behavioral area?
Well, I think a good defense in terms of coming up with effective, validated products that we know work and are designed the right way is an offense. I think that the clinical societies need to get together and put out what their recommendations are for, and their guidelines and design criteria for an effective product. Government agencies and healthcare networks could do the same. I also think that in terms of coming up with the right criteria for evaluating efficacy, You know, it's interesting what's happened with the internet coming up and providing a lot of information to people. We now have consumer reports and reviews, and people have figured out which ones are reliable and are gold standards. I think the consumers will have a big say in what works and what doesn't work, both by the data they provide and how that's harnessed, but also their interacting with each other. So I think we will see, in addition to our health, the point of care is going to be the patient right now, and I also think the point of validation is going to be with the patient and patient groups and patient organizations. So I think the mechanism that we determine efficacy will change. It won't be the random double-blind controlled trial. I think there'll be some other ways of collecting information and consumers providing input, sharing input, and being part of the critique and validation process, particularly when it comes to behavioral health care. And we're going to have much more in the way of tools for objective assessments. What's so far been very subjective is now going to become very objective with the new digital medicine technology we have. And that's going to open up a whole field of data analytics that we haven't had before. I think we'll see something like auto reviews that are sort of consumer-like, perhaps promoted by some revered institution like a healthcare network, that are endorsing some of these products while they're in the process of going through clinical trials and before they have a chance to go through the FDA process. And I suspect over time, some of the processes that you have will adapt to this tsunami of digital medicine that is coming out.
The danger, though, in this, Henry, and I'll just give you a specific example, is that when you have no FDA approved treatments for things like post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury, you know, mild and moderate, where people have really huge cognitive issues and it affects their lives tremendously, and people aren't getting that FDA approval, I see soldiers bouncing from treatment to treatment that does not have efficacy. And they're spending huge amounts of money because none of these treatments have CPT codes. And they work for a little while, and then they're right back in the situation they were before, and they bounce to the next treatment. And that's a scary situation when you're talking about a population that can't afford, you know, to pay those monies. I mean, we've got VSOs, veteran service organizations, that are raising money right now to send people into hyperbaric oxygen chambers to treat their traumatic brain injury. And I'm not knocking hyperbaric oxygen, but I'm here to tell you, when I was in the military, we did study after study, and we found no efficacy in it. Yet this is huge amounts of money, up to $60,000 in treatments in order to get a veteran into a hyperbaric oxygen tube for 60 days. And that's the kind of thing that really scares me. And I totally agree with what Carlos said. If we could get the system, if we could get those researchers to be early on, begin to work with the FDA, not wait. If we had data standards that were written to the approval of the FDA, so that when you brought data to the FDA, I fell for it hook, line, and sinker that the FDA was the big, bad, ugly thing that was stopping us from getting. I have totally reversed course and believe it is a system where you have not applied things like data standards. I know that war is different than science, but the fact of the matter is we have very specific standards for things like coordinates and other things. We share data amongst each other because that's the only way you survive in that. But we have a system today that is set up in the exact opposite of that, and I think this tsunami that you talk about scares me in many ways, because I think it could be avoided, and we could get the FDA approval of many of these things.
Well, I think the point you make about
work with the FDA earlier on in the process.
I think your point about standards is very apt, and I think the groups that are developing a response to the tsunami would love to have a pathway if standards are promulgated and guidelines are issued from groups, so that some of these natural experiments that you talked about can be harvested and compared, not through the random double-blind crossover design, because that's not the case in this, but more in terms of big data analytics. Look at if we have standard ways of comparing efficacy, I think we'll have a natural way to provide information to the FDA and other regulatory groups to validate efficacy.
Let me add a couple of things to add on this. You point out a key problem where you don't have enough evidence. You don't have enough approved treatments, right? And you don't have a fast way to get evidence for some of these other things. But I do want to point out that this is occurring in the context of probably the worst epidemic of death rates in the mental health substance abuse field in the history of this country. So in the last 15 years, suicide rates are up 15 to 20% and escalating. Opiate death rates are up 200 to 400% and escalating. This is at a time, I would say, where there's more money going in for treatment for mental health substance abuse ever in the history of this country, with the ACA, the parity law, increased recognition of these problems. So the system is failing. And to add the other piece to that, most of the treatments are old. There's not been a new medication approved for psychotropic for a novel compound for 3 decades. The psychosocial cognitive behavior therapy, which is a standard in the field, has been around for 4 decades. Psychosocial rehabilitation for many people has been around for 3 to 4 decades. So you have a field where there's not been a lot of innovation that's approved and regulated or standardized. So that's you've got these two kind of serious issues weighing on this. I would say one thing, though, Pete, about the FDA and its role is the FDA doesn't have to be the only regulatory process for standardizing something like this. If you look at healthcare in general, the private nonprofit sector is very involved in setting quality standards. From the Joint Commission, all medical specialty professionals are certified by a private nonprofit. There's not an FDA process or a government rule. So one of the questions would be, if you're going to run all this through the FDA, we're going to have to expand the FDA significantly, or can we find another trusted body for the things that don't fall clearly under the FDA pathway, which some of these treatments don't, some do. So anyway, I'd love to hear some comments on that. But this is a real crisis we're in. And many of the treatments we have that are paid for and delivered every day to the best that we can, good clinicians, not money a problem, don't work for a lot of people. So let me so I don't know, Carlos, would you like to respond to this back and forth with us on this?
So a couple of points. One is, FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine. So if a physician believes that they need to treat their patient in some fashion, we don't regulate that approach. Center for Devices, unlike other product areas at the FDA, is by law required to look at valid scientific evidence. So we look at randomized control studies all the way down to significant human experience. We're also looking at ways to assess registry data, which is these non-traditional ways of gathering evidence. And I think that's encouraging to hear, because many of our devices that we look at, they're very hard to run a sham on. Some of the prosthetics, why would you have a randomized blinded control for a prosthetic? I mean, it's sort of even hard to do. So I think devices the device area is adapting to the needs of the technology that it regulates, and that's a good thing. We also work with the CPSC, Consumer Product Safety Commission, for non-medical type products, as well as the FCC. So there's that patchwork. With regard to companies that say, I'll sort of act now and ask for forgiveness later, that could be very problematic. And especially on the back end, if there is a product that is affecting the structure function of the body in a deleterious way, I think the public expects someone to make sure that what they're buying or what they're using is safe and effective. It's two very easy questions there, and not to have those questions addressed when the product may be sold, throughout the U.S. is a problem that I would hope, the cost of resolving that problem at the back end is a lot more than having a free pathway in the pre-submission process at the front end. I hope that forums like this help to educate folks that we're sort of available. The hard part is just reaching out to who and how.
Adam,
Yeah, there's one issue that we haven't really talked about. It's it's not just the amount of evidence, it's how that evidence is digested and delivered to the public that's also an issue. When I advise and even invest in other companies, besides where I put most of my time, and try to understand the responsible way to go through a pathway that isn't the FDA. And that's reasonable in cases, even according to the FDA. If you do have a general health or wellness product and you don't have a clear clinical indication and you have modest side effects, that might be a reasonable route. The problem that I see happen all the time, and where I try to help as best as I can as an advisor, is that you need to have a very, very transparent and clear balance between the evidence that you have and how you present it. And we've seen cases where there's been an imbalance between evidence and marketing. And that causes a tremendous amount of problems, and that's where the FTC becomes involved. And just because you have something that might not have a lot of evidence and you might think it's safe, it's not appropriate to claim more than you know, even if it's not part of the FDA purview. And that mistake is made all the time. You feel like we're not FDA regulated, we're not a clinical indication, therefore we could say whatever we want. And that's just not true. And we've seen many even high-profile examples of that being a bad pathway. And so I feel like there is a way to go about the FDA process that we're trying to do ourselves, and that is early and deeply engaged. And then if you're not doing that, and there are cases where that's appropriate, there's still a set of guidelines and rules that are required to deal with the public in a very transparent and fair way. And if they're violated, then everything falls apart. And because of that challenge right now, there's a lot of mistrust in the public, the scientific pushback. It's tumultuous. I'm in it all the time. We haven't talked about that, but it is part of the problem.
Henry, do you think a way to address the pent-up demand and acute need that you described, and to facilitate better appropriate evaluation and validation, as Adam described and has been talked about here, is there a way to facilitate that process by some of the nonprofits that you described, by maybe being proactive and clearing the pathway a little bit more?
Well, yeah, I do think that we need something in addition to the FDA for particularly the health and wellness, or what you're pointing out, Adam, which is there are a lot of digital apps out there. I mean, the behavioral alone might be 5,000. I'm not sure it's already, in the medical side, I don't know, it must be hundreds of thousands. And I share your concern, Pete, about how do we evaluate those, even where there's particularly in a situation where the FDA is not going to be involved, they're not legally required or going to or set up to review. I do think there's a need to set up a private nonprofit, some trusted entity, whether it's like the Joint Commission or another entity who could do some level of certification. Is there evidence? What's the quality of the evidence? Also, at least making that public. There are a few entities out there, like CyberGuide is one, but it's expensive to do this. And so they've done this for a few apps where they've tried to review the science, and then they're trying to have consumer rankings for some of the cognitive interventions for the schizophrenia remediation apps. Because there is a huge number of these things that, don't make a claim for treating a diagnosis, but they're treating this, for helping with the symptoms of those diagnoses, which in the mental health world, that's what base the diagnosis on. So, yes, I think some form of some kind of a consortium or the creation of entity. We have this, NCQA and CARF, Joint Commission. These are all private nonprofit bodies that actually certify and regulate the managed care industry, large providers. So we have mechanisms here that we could use. And I desperately think we need it, because we have two problems. One is, how do we get better treatments out there quicker, and then how do we make sure they're safe and effective? So.
You do that by advancing the science, and I think that somebody's got to step back and look and say, listen, we've been doing this for a long time and we don't like the results. Let's go back and look at the process. And I would argue the process is fundamentally broken. You know,
the research process.
the research
Yeah.
process is fundamentally broken. When someone goes and works with the FDA early on, they get penalized. They get penalized because working with the FDA is time consuming, and it should be time consuming because the FDA wants proof. They want to ensure that the data you're providing to them isn't cherry picked, that it is a complete data set, that it's collected to standards that they agree to. And when that happens, it takes time. And when the system turns back and says, well, you haven't produced the papers you need for the follow-on funding, you go to step 2 because you were working with the FDA early in the process and you had a plan for translation, I think that's a fundamentally flawed system. And that's what I think we really need to take a look at. The other point I'd make, if you want to see a good case study, and I know it's very traumatic brain injury specific, but we all have kids, and in my case, grandkids that are playing sports. And if you go back and look at APOE4 as a risk indicator for people who are going to have a rough time recovering from concussion, if you look it up on the internet, you'll find articles going all the way back to 1994 that talk about it being a risk factor for having a problem recovering from concussion. And it was brought to me as advice as an issue. And I said, well, gosh, if this is true, why would I make anybody with APOE4 from their mother and their father a bomb disposal expert? And my lawyer says, well, you can't do that because it hasn't been proven. There are 40 articles all the way to today that talk about APOE4, but we've never got it above 50 to 60 folks. No one shares their data, and we haven't got the calculus we need to take it over the finish line so we can all tell our kids whether or not they should want to be linebackers for the Pittsburgh Steelers or not because of their genetic makeup, you know? These are the kinds of things that I think are just sorely show that we have a system that in many ways is broken that needs to be reformed.
Well,
Pete, I
one
couldn't agree
potential
more.
solution for that is using the fact that we now can have some standards. Back in the days in the 90s, it was hard to share data. But now sharing data, especially if standards are established, perhaps by the clinical societies or by some regulatory agencies, would allow people to take these small studies but have them add up to one big study. So I think we're in a better position now.
I think one idea would be to let CDISC be the ones who puts together your data standards. I mean, the FDA relies on CDISC, but I see more pushback from that because people want to protect their data than embracing the fact that data standards would be a positive step forward.
Well, Pete, I would agree with you about the sharing the data and the reforms of the research community, right? But part of the reforms, as I would see in the research community, is paying attention and funding some of these studies of these other types of interventions, like completing the APOE, whatever, or some of the things you're doing, virtual reality you're doing, is there's not a lot of government research money going into that area. It's sort of taking it out of the bench. You say you've got first level of proof, right? I mean, one of the reasons you have to commercialize your product is there's not government money, I think, a lot of it, that would say, okay, I'm going to help you validate this for clinical use or even non-clinical use. So it seems to me that would be another reformation, is to put some of the basic research money that's going out there, I'm sure some of the scientists don't agree with this, and putting it into this, let's finish the translation. Let's finish some of these things that we know have pretty good evidence, and let's make it, pull the data, whatever you have to do, fund it.
It's true. It's very challenging to do that type of translation in a university system. At least I felt it. It's very hard to get NIH funds to do it. When you're doing a study that's that long, you're not generating peer-reviewed publications that you need for tenure and other types of advancement. It's the reason I started a company. I had no intentions of ever doing anything like that. Trained as an MD, PhD, I have no entrepreneurial background. It was just that I couldn't find a way. I've learned over the years, but I couldn't find a way to do it as a professor at a university. Interestingly enough, I've been able to maintain that position and continue to do basic science and peer-reviewed publication, but I realized to do that translation step, we needed a different model, and a company and an industry model was the way that we found to do it, where we could get investors, so we get large amounts of money to run these expensive, long time consuming trials, in the company and then do the basic science in the lab. And maybe that's a broken model. It's just the way that we figured out how to do both. But yeah, I agree. I never tried to tackle that as a university professor. And that could be a problem because there's many of my colleagues that won't do it, but they also won't start a company. And so then that research just dies there in the lab. And that happens all the time.
Why don't we open this up to questions from the audience and or comments, suggestions? You got to speak up.
I have a whole bunch. The first thing I think that's broken is our funding system, our federal funding system. There should be funding collaboration and a system. I love the open science one line. I could imagine that in that facility, you have several scientists screaming at each other every day, doing test analysis of data, challenging each other's research. So I would really trust something from London. I don't know what happens with intellectual property in your case, and is it international? So those are my two questions for you. The thing that frightens me about the devices is any person suffering from schizophrenia, paranoia, that has audio or visual hallucinations, how on earth are you going to get a digital product that works with it? That's a question. And you used to work for NIMH. My question was, you talked about old school treatments to try and prove what's covered. And you were saying that they might not be as effective as they could be. Let's say that. So why aren't they working? And is there any effort being put forward to fix or analyze to improve in the face-to-face analysis and therapy?
Anybody want to respond to that? Any of that? Those questions? Or?
Yeah.
Which
I could
part of
start.
it?
So I could start. For the devices, for psychiatric indications, whether it's a moderate risk or high risk device, we'd want to make sure that the device was studied within that intended user population. There may be an opportunity to have a physician manual as well as a patient manual if the product is targeting a high risk population. So we'd want to make sure that, if the device is going to be used by a patient population, that it's going to be safe and effective when it's being used by that patient population. That would be sort of a straightforward way to address that concern, which I think is a very important concern. The one other point I want to make on the funding issue about publications versus interacting with regulation is that there's a lot of sponsors now or funders, and we're trying this out with NIH. We're exploring this with other private sector entities, is that those that are funding, as part of their funding requirements, the milestones, they put into the guidelines that a pre-submission must be sent to FDA as part of your 6-month deliverable. And therefore, that helps to balance the requirements versus publications that might also be looked at very closely.
That's private funders, though.
What?
Private funders?
Yeah. So, it's not a perfect system, but I think there are these steps that are happening to help encourage translational applications, applied sciences reach the marketplace.
But if the NIH did that, if the NIH required that, if it's good enough for a private funder, why doesn't the NIH require it? And I would argue it's pushback from the universities.
Right.
Universities have no desire to do that. I mean, my biggest bills in one line is paying for data curation. Why? Because the university won't pay for data curation, okay? And the NIH won't pay for data curation. Neither one of them will. And you better curate your data if you want to go to the FDA.
Right, that's a great point. I think we are trying this out with the Neurology Institute, NINDS, as well as mental health, on some of the brain initiative activities that have recently come up.
So when are you taking over the NIH? So you want to respond?
More generally, we're in a scientific funding crisis at the government level. I don't think that that's a controversial statement. And so when you wind up at that low percentile levels, almost historically low right now, there's all sorts of cracks that become apparent. We face them every day. And this is one of them. It's not the only one.
Lots of them.
Yeah.
I would argue that it could be a blessing in disguise. If it forces people to collaborate, to share data, for somebody to start a journal of I was wrong, and people get rewarded for reporting the fact that their hypothesis was not correct, and let's add this to the body of science so we don't repeat it. But we're wasting money today on research projects that were just proven years ago, but we don't document them. I mean,
I agree.
There are lots of issues.
Other questions from the audience or comments?
Yeah, this is a question for Adam. I actually have friends at the FDA, so I can expect this. Just a question about, like, in terms of going that way, you know, you have to publish and do all this stuff to get a tenure track position, and you can just get tenure. So, but you, and also in terms of being in tech, right, being innovative, you have to build these collaborations. So, are you able to even do that as a starting out person, like person early in their career? The trajectories are very different.
It's super hard. I mean, I didn't start any of this till I was already tenured. It's really hard. You know, the whole university system has to change. There was a time where, in order to get tenure, you needed to have multiple R01s, which was like the NIH, you know, hallmark of productive scientists. And right now, it's really hard to get an R01, even a single R01, harder than it's ever been. And also, there was a time, like when I was training, where when you were in academics and you looked at industry, that was like a dirty thing to do.
Yeah.
And as a professor, if one of your students didn't become a postdoc in an academic institute but went to industry, you essentially failed.
Right.
That was a failure. That might be something that you don't even tell people. It's true. It's like these are old concepts that are changing now. You know, probably half the people that come out of our group go to industry. Even UCSF in general, which is not the way it was at all anymore.
It used to be like leaving the high church, and you were viewed as a heretic if you left.
Oh, undoubtedly. You know, to me, to hold a professor position and also have started a company and other, you know, this was just, it would have been very uncomfortable for me to even walk down the hall. Now I feel like people almost look like, with some sense of admiration, like, wow, I should do something like that. So I think things are changing dramatically, but I still would say that given the current system, if you want to be a very translational scientist, where your peer-reviewed publication rate will be lower because you're doing bigger, collaborative, longer scale trials, it will be challenging in the universities.
Well, we're going to have to stop, so we've run out of time, but I want to thank our panel. This is a great discussion, and let's give them a big hand. Thank you.